Nintendeen is spurging out pretty hardcore over the past couple of days because it couldn't be more obvious to him and everyone else that the entire grift has collapsed. There's just no recovery from it going forward. What we're seeing now is just a complete and total decline of the grift. Like, what we're seeing now is that people are starting to see through the nonsense and pointing things out and noticing things. And the simple reality is that Nintendo has won the console generation. Emulation is not going to undermine them. PC is not going to replace them. Xbox and PlayStation are the ones that are on the way out. You know, the entire grift, like, of Nintendeen, the idea that the Switch 2 was too expensive is not going to survive in an industry where Grand Theft Auto 6 normalizes $100 games and new pieces of gaming hardware cost double of what Switch 2 does. Like, if you believe that the PS5, the PS6, or the Xbox Helix are going to be under $600, like, you're completely delusional. That's just it is what it is. It's not going to work out. We are seeing like a complete gaming crash, exactly as I predicted back in 2014. Okay, like, it became obvious to me that, you know, during that period, that the Wii U was the real winner of that console generation, because Nintendo understood how to create good games. They understood how to make money on their hardware, and all they really needed to do was boost the sales of the hardware itself, because there was nothing wrong with the software or the product or anything else. The Wii U was just a victim of circumstance, right? It was a successor to the most successful console ever made, the Wii, which far outstripped the PS2 in relevancy, which is still played today, actually. The Wii was just this very successfully damage controlled thing where, like, a good chunk of the audience, like, genuinely believed halfway through the generation that, like, the Wii was on the way out and it was failing. And it wasn't because of, like, anything Nintendo did or the games themselves. It was entirely because of third parties and their game journal, like, shills, like, just coming out and, like, damage controlling Nintendo, right? And that's been happening for the past 20 years. You know, I remember when people were saying Pokemon was on the way out, you know, after Gen 1 ended. Okay, like, okay, Pokemania's over, time to pack up and go home and play a real game. Like, that was the mindset at the time. And here we are, like, years later, just seeing how everybody is just kind of, like, bending over backwards, making excuses, like, trying to deny reality. And, like, the Switch 2 has been, like, a huge success so far. You know, people are desperately trying to, like, complain about the stock price, or trying to pretend that Mario Tennis Fever underperformed, or, like, saying that, like, Nintendo was only relevant because of Pokemon. And, like, the reality is that we're going to start seeing, like, major boosts in, like, pretty much every major Nintendo IP. You know, Star Fox is back, Bonanza's back, Mario Kart is back. Like, again, these are all giant hits. But the narrative right now is that, like, these aren't good enough, or they aren't doing as well as Mario or Zelda would have, and that simply isn't true. Like, what we're seeing is, like, the result of a healthy ecosystem where, like, all of Nintendo's brands are relevant. You know, they have their audiences. They have this, like, wide range of titles to choose from, and there's just no denying the fact that what Nintendo does is just significantly better than the rest of the competition. Like, what we're seeing now is just a complete and total just waste of, like, of what everyone else is doing. Like, what we're seeing is just a complete and total collapse of the rest of the gaming industry. Like, what we're seeing now is just a total collapse of, like, the traditional gaming ecosystem. And, like, you know, back in the PS3 era, you know, people celebrated, like, the $600 PS3. You know, people celebrated the move to HD. People celebrated, like, the longer dev times and, like, the AAA games, because the idea was that gaming was growing up. You know, the idea was that, like, gaming was becoming more adult focused, and that games were getting better and better, and that Nintendo was getting left in the past. And, like, that didn't happen. You know, in a lot of ways, the problems we're seeing now have roots in what Sony was doing 25 years ago, where, like, they only sold the PS1 based on the promise of FMV. You know, that's the only reason why. This is why there's such a huge, like, dissonance between, like, and Nintendo owners and PlayStation owners. Like, whenever PlayStation owners try and argue that their games look better than N64, they're specifically referring to the FMV. Like, they're not referring to the actual in-game models and the stuff you actually do in the gameplay, because the actual games on N64 are better than anything on PlayStation. Like, I would argue that the stealth segment in Ocarina of Time is better. It's more elaborate, more well constructed, more fun to play than Metal Gear Solid. And that seems like ridiculous, but it is true. Like, and that was just like, one minor area in like the greatest game ever made, but like, Metal Gear Solid was entirely carried by ripping off anime tropes and having Hollywood voice actors voice everything, right? Like, that was just the reality behind Metal Gear Solid at the time. That was the reality behind like these games at the time, is that like they were carried entirely by like trying to be more like movies. In a sense, like, nothing has changed with PlayStation. People can complain about like woke culture and the female protagonist all they want. The real reason why PlayStation is failing is because they did not produce good enough video games. Like, they were not competitive enough in this space. And that's very self-evident if you play any amount of Nintendo games at all. Again, I think it's very telling when, like, whenever you see people complaining about, like, say, Xenoblade or Fire Emblem or what have you, like, so many of them do this thing where they make it very obvious that, like, they don't play Fire Emblem, they've never played Fire Emblem, they never will play Fire Emblem, but they hate it because, like, it's not, like, what a Nintendo game should be. Like, they think Nintendo games should just be, like, Mario and Zelda games all the time, with no real regard for, like, how this is a completely different game from a company that, like, has had great success with these games. There's no regard for the people who actually like these games. Like, again, like, these games being successful is seen as a problem for, like, certain Nintendo fans because they get in the way of, like, games that they would rather get announced instead. And it's just such a weird way of looking at it, but it's why this entire situation has been a joke. Like, the idea that the Switch 2 was underperforming or failing, it all hinges on this idea that, like, nobody wants to play something like Donkey Kong Bonanza or Kirby Air Riders or Mario Tennis or like any of this stuff. And it's something that, like, just doesn't hold up under any scrutiny whatsoever. Like, it's something that we do have to call out immediately. It's something that we do have to address. It's something that, like, is becoming a bit of a problem. Like, why exactly are we led to believe that any of this stuff is going to severely impact Nintendo at all? And the answer is it's not. It's not going to. Like, there's no way, there's no possible way for it to, like, affect Nintendo. Like, people really thought that, like, Power World would destroy Nintendo and it would be way more popular than Pokemon and they would win the lawsuit. And like, that just didn't happen. Like, Power World's coming out on the 10th, and yet, like, nobody cares. Like, the game is, like, a complete disaster. But are you going to see, like, anybody acknowledge that? Or are you going to see anybody admit that, like, they lost a lawsuit? Like, I imagine what everyone's going to do is that they're just going to try and argue that, like, Nintendo only won due to being a bigger company and not due to, like, any legal precedent. Like, ignoring, like, the actual ruling and, like, the actual logistics behind it. Like, again, we're just gonna see people make more and more excuses about why Nintendo supposedly failed. And I think more and more we're gonna see that entire cope just completely fall apart. There's just not gonna be any going back to the way things used to be. And the more they try and do this, the more we see Nintendeen run his mouth, trying to tell people that Nintendo did not give 10% raises when they totally did. Like, the more people are going to look at this stuff and realize it's just grifting. People are going to be like where I was at 20 years ago when I was seeing, like, Game Journal smugly predict the failure of the Wii and how the PS3 was going to reign supreme. And then, like, they actually both went out on the show floor and, like, the Wii just dominated. Okay, it was just undeniable. Like, game journals were just completely taken aback by it. And in the Wii, in a sense, is the ultimate culmination of, Gunpei Yokoi's philosophy, lateral thinking with withered technology, like Nintendo's core fundamental design philosophy. Like, we are seeing how that philosophy has led Nintendo to this position where they are completely secure where they're at. Like, the Switch 2 is far more affordable than the other consoles. You know, it is cheaper to produce than the other consoles. It is bringing them in more money than the other consoles. They have, quicker. They're quicker to produce games than the other consoles. Like, again, there's no reason to think that Nintendo is struggling at all against the competition unless you delusionally believe that, like, somehow something like God of War Laufey is going to be better than what Nintendo offers. Because you're delusional if you think, like, God of War is better than, like, Bayonetta 3 or, like, any of these other action games that Nintendo has. Astral Chain is a 100% Nintendo IP now. Like, the reality is, like, the entire illusion that people had that, like, Nintendo was for kids while PlayStation was for, like, the adults, like, that entire grift has fallen apart, and that becomes more and more apparent every single year.